Welcome back to One Boring Historian. Before we dive in, I want to know, where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Midnight in your bedroom, or sneaking this in at lunch? Drop it in the comments. It is always fun to see this little community scattered across time zones. And if you enjoy these long, quiet walks through history, don't forget to like the video and subscribe. It helps more curious minds stumble into this corner of the past. Now, imagine it's 1692. You live in a small Puritan village, and one winter morning, someone points a finger at you. Would you have been an accuser, the accused, or the neighbor praying no one noticed you? This is the story of the Salem Witch Trials. If we are to understand what happened here, in this small, inconsequential patch of New England, we must first do the difficult work of forgetting. We must strip away the modern imagery, the caricatures of pointy hats and screaming mobs. We must, for a moment, let the asphalt of the tourist roads fade back into the earth. Let the electric lights dim and die, and allow the deep, profound, and almost suffocating darkness of a 17th century night to reclaim this place. Close your eyes, if you will, and let the year dissolve back to 1691. Not 1692, not yet. For now, it is simply winter, a hard, bitter winter along the Massachusetts coast. The Atlantic wind does not merely blow here. It seems to sharpen its edge on the endless stands of pine and oak before slicing through the small, scattered settlements. It whips across the frozen marshes. It moans through the chinks in timber-framed houses, and it carries with it the scent of wood smoke, of thawing salt water, and of the deep, cold earth itself. This is Salem village, not the prosperous port of Salem town to the south, with its bustling wharves and worldly merchants. No, this is the village, an inland parish of farmsteads, carved out of the wilderness with immense effort and perpetual anxiety. To stand here, on the high ground near the meeting house, is to witness a human presence that feels precarious. The fields, now dusted with a grimy late winter snow, are stubbled with the stumps of felled giants, the trees that had stood for centuries. The houses low, dark structures with steeply pitched roofs to shed the snow are not ranged in a neat village square as one might imagine. They are scattered, each on its own plot of land, separated by stretches of skeletal forest and frozen, fallow fields. The roads connecting them are little more than muddy ruts, now frozen into treacherous, jagged tracks from any doorway. One's view is sharply limited. To the east, perhaps, a glimpse of a neighbor's chimney smoke. To the west, the immense, brooding wall of the forest. It is this proximity to the untamed woods that defines the atmosphere, the psychology of this place. The forest is not a place of recreation. It is the unknown. It is the domain of wolves and bears, of the Wampanoag and Abenaki who rightly view these expanding English settlements with simmering hostel, itty, and, in the Puritan mind, of things far less tangible but infinitely more terrifying. The wilderness was where the devil resided. It was the physical manifestation of chaos, a stark and ever-present contrast to the hard one, desperately maintained order they sought to impose upon their lives and their souls. And within those houses, life was measured not in hours, but in tasks, in prayers, and in the slow, patient struggle against the cold. Let us imagine crossing the threshold of one such home. The door is heavy, low, and you must stoop to enter. The first sensation is not one of sight, but of smell. It is a complex, thick aroma that hangs in the air, a permanent tapestry woven from wood smoke. The pungent scent of drying herbs hung from the ceiling beams, the earthy smell of potatoes and turnips stored in a root cellar below, the faint, sharp tang of animal fat from tallow candles. And always underlying it all, the smell of damp will and human sweat. The air is hazy, the light is dim, provided by a small, precious windowed panes made of old paper ore. For the more fortunate, of thick, greenish glass sand by the flickering fire in the great hearth. This hearth is the heart of the home, its absolute center. It is a massive construction of stone, and the effort to keep it fed is a constant, daily labor. The fire is banked at night, but never allowed to go out, for rekindling it without a neighbor's ember is a difficult and dreaded task. Its light dances on the surfaces of simple, hand-wrought objects, a wooden trencher, a pewter spoon, an iron pot suspended on a crane. There are no luxuries here. A family might own a book, almost invariably the Bible, its pages thumb-soft and smooth from daily reading. The furniture is heavy, functional and sparse. Up a steep, ladder-like staircase, or in a low loft, the children sleep, several to a bed, huddled together for warmth under coarse woolen blankets. The rhythm of life here is dictated by the sun, by the seasons, and by the meeting-house bell. The day begins before dawn. In the deep, frigid blackness of a winter morning, there is no lingering in bed. The cold forbids it. The first sound is the scraping of the hearth's ashes, the rustle of kindling, the breath of a bellows. The day is filled with work that is physical, repetitive and essential. For the men and boys, it is the care of livestock in the barn structure attached to the house for warmth, so the lowing of cattle and the smell of manure are a constant presence. It is the repair of tools, the chopping of a seemingly endless supply of firewood, the planning of the spring planting. For the women and girls, the work is within the house, a ceaseless cycle of transformation, transforming raw wool into yarn, yarn into cloth, cloth into clothing, transforming grain into flour, flour into bread, transforming milk into butter and cheese, transforming a slaughtered pig into food that will last for months, smoking, salting, rendering. It is work that is never finished, and it is performed in a world of shadows and flickering flame. A world where hands are always busy, and the mind is left to its own devices, to wander, to remember, to worry. And above all this, permeating every action, every thought, is religion. This is not the gentle, metaphorical faith of a later age. This is a stark, demanding, and all-consuming Calvinist Puritanism. To these people, God was not a distant, benevolent figure. He was an immediate, omnipotent, and terrifyingly arbitrary judge. The world was a battleground in a cosmic war between God and Satan, and their own souls were the contested territory. The doctrine of predestination meant that from the moment of creation, God had chosen only a select few for salvation. Everyone else was damned to hellfire for eternity, and there was nothing, no good deed, no amount of prayer, no fervent belief that could change your predetermined fate. You could not know if you were saved. You could only search for signs, for hints of God's grace in your life. This search created a state of perpetual, low-grade spiritual anxiety. A failed crop, a stillborn child, a barn struck by lightning, these could be seen as signs of God's displeasure. Conversely, a healthy harvest or a successful trade might be a faint indication of his favor. This mindset turned the community inward. It fostered a culture of intense self-scrutiny and, just as importantly, the scrutiny of one's neighbors. To see a neighbor prosper while you suffered could breed a poisonous mixture of envy and suspicion. Perhaps their prosperity was a sign of God's grace, or perhaps it was a sign of something else. A darker bargain. This internal tension was mirrored by a very external, worldly one, the deep and growing rift between Salem village and Salem town. Salem town, a day's journey away by cart, was a different universe. It was a cosmopolitan port, connected to the wider world of the Atlantic. Its wealthy merchants lived in fine, multi-storied houses, wore imported fabrics, and concerned themselves with trade, politics, and profit. They were becoming less fervently pious, more pragmatic. To the farmers of Salem village, the town represented worldliness, vanity, and a dangerous turning away from the strict, pure faith of their fathers. The village was, in many ways, a backwater. Jealous of the town's wealth and influence, they wanted their own independent parish, their own minister, to free themselves from the political and religious control of the distant town. This fight had been going on for years, fracturing the village itself into factions. Families took sides, arguments over land boundaries and church privileges festered, and old grudges were passed down like inheritances. It was a small, isolated community, already taught with religious fear, now also pulled apart by petty, deeply felt secular squabbles. The social fabric was worn thin, its threads frayed and ready to snap. At the center of this fragile world stood the meeting house. It was more than a church. It was the literal and figurative gathering place. It was a stark, unadorned building, as devoid of decoration inside as their theology was of ritual. There was no cross, no stained glass, no altar. There was only a pulpit, high and looming, from which the minister preached for hours on end. The sermons were not stories of comfort. They were dissertations on doctrine, stark reminders of human depravity, and vivid descriptions of the hell that awaited the unrepentant. The congregation sat on hard benches, men on one side, women on the other, children with their families. The enslaved indigenous and African people often relegated to the back or the balcony. They sat in their woolen cloaks, their breath misting in the cold air, listening, watching, judging. The minister was not just a spiritual leader. He was a political figure, a community leader. The key to the village's coveted independence, and the current minister, the Reverend Samuel Paris, was a man who seemed to embody the tensions of the place he served. A former merchant from Barbados, he had failed in the world of commerce before turning to the pulpit. He was a stern, rigid, and seemingly insecure man, acutely aware of the factions within his congregation, of the families who supported him and those who grumbled about his salary and his firewood allowance. He brought with him from Barbados to enslaved people a man named John Indian and a woman named Tituba. His sermons often focused on a particularly chilling theme, the idea that the devil was not just in the wilderness, but that he was here, now, actively recruiting witches from within their very own congregation. He spoke of an invisible world, a spectral world, that pressed in upon their own, and of the minions of Satan who walked among them unseen. As the long winter of 1691 to 92 wore on, the isolation deepened. The days were short, the nights interminable. The world shrank to the size of a single firelit room, in the silence between the crackle of the flames and the moan of the wind. Imaginations could turn inward, fears, both spiritual and worldly, could fester, a child's strange fit, a sudden illness in the livestock, a bad dream, the shadow that seemed to move just at the edge of the candlelight in a different time. These might be explained away, but here, in this time, in this place, saturated with a theology of invisible forces and existential dread, they were kindling, and in the Reverend Paris's household, as in others, the young minds were not idle. His daughter, 9-year-old Betty, and his niece, 11-year-old Abigail Williams, spent their days in the endless, dim routine of women's work, to break the monotony. to inject a little mystery into their circumscribed world. They would sometimes seek out Tituba, in the kitchen, in the barn, by the fire in the evening. She would perhaps tell them stories, stories of the world she came from, stories different from the stern warnings from the pulpit, stories of fortune-telling, of magic, of omens and signs. It was a harmless diversion, a secret game, a way to touch the mysterious and the forbidden that their daily lives so vehemently denied. It was just a game, a winter's pastime for bored children. But in Salem village, in the winter of 1691, the air was already thick with fear. The community was a vessel, waiting to be filled, and into this vessel, a single, seemingly innocuous drop of mystery was about to fall. The ripples would begin, slowly at first, almost imperceptibly, circling out from the minister's house, into the community, into the meeting house, until they would eventually break against the very foundations of the world these people had built. But for now, there is only the cold, the dark, the silence, and the waiting. The winter of 1691 to 92 did not merely arrive in Salem village. It entrenched itself. It was a season that seemed to feed on the isolation of the place, amplifying it, turning each farmstead into its own solitary island in a frozen sea of white and grey. The days were short, pallid affairs, the sun a weak, brassy coin barely clearing the treetops before beginning its hurried descent. The nights, by contrast, were vast, deep, and absolute. This was a darkness we in the modern world can scarcely comprehend, a darkness unmitigated by any artificial light. A darkness that pressed itself against the oiled paper windows. A living thing that seeped through the smallest chink in the wall. A darkness that was not merely an absence of light, but a presence in itself. It was filled with sounds, the groan of burdened branches, the scuttling of unseen things in the attic thatch, the lonely, haunting cry of a fox, a sound uncomfortably close to a woman's scream. Within the household of the Reverend Samuel Paris, the atmosphere was particularly charged. The parsonage was not a home of warmth and comfort. Even by the austere standards of the village, Paris was a man who carried his grievances like a second coat, and the chill of his discontent seemed to permeate the very timbers of the house. He was embroiled in a bitter and protracted dispute with the parish committee over his salary, the provision of his firewood, and ultimately, the ownership of the parsonage itself. These were not abstract legalities. They were fights over survival, over status, over the very right to remain in this community. The air in the house was thick with a tension that had little to do with theology and everything to do with the humiliating realities of worldly struggle. His sermons, delivered in the freezing meeting house, grew increasingly strident, increasingly focused on a besieged godly community fighting not just the devil out in the wilderness, but the treachery and betrayal festering within its own walls in this environment. The children of the house lived their lives. His daughter, Elizabeth, or Betty, was 9 years old. His orphaned niece, Abigail Williams, was 11. Theirs was a world of duty and discipline, of long hours spent in silent chores, carding wool, spinning flax, stitching, mending. Their play, what little there was of it, was circumscribed, conducted in whispers when the adults were not present, their primary companions. Aside from each other were the two enslaved people in the household, Tituba and her husband, John Indian. Tituba's origins are shrouded in historical debate, likely indigenous South American, possibly from the Arawak nation, and brought from Barbados by Paris, to the girls. She was a figure of fascination. She represented a world utterly alien to their own, a world of different sounds, different stories, different knowledge, It was in the deepening twilight of these endless winter afternoons, in the dim, smoky space of the kitchen or the barn, that the games began. To call it fortune-telling would be to grant it a formality it did not possess. It was a diversion, a secret shared, a way to pierce the oppressive monotony. It is not difficult to imagine the scene, the light failing outside, the fire casting long, dancing shadows, the air cold enough to see their breath. Heidegger, perhaps to amuse them, perhaps to connect with a sliver of her own past, would tell them stories, not the stern, fire and brimstone parables of the meeting house, but something else. Stories of omens, of spirits in the natural world, of methods to see the shape of things to come. The most persistent legend, the one that would take root in the collective memory with terrifying consequence, involved a Venus glass. This was not a complex magical apparatus. It was a simple, domestic object, a common egg. The white of the egg was emptied into a glass of water, and the shapes it formed as it coagulated were interpreted. It was a form of scrying, a folk practice common in many cultures, utterly forbidden by the strict Puritan orthodoxy that viewed any attempt to divine the future as a compact with the devil. For the girls, this was the heart of its allure. It was forbidden knowledge, the specific fortune they sought. According to the whispers that would later explode into testimony, was to discover the trade of their future husbands, a harmless, childish fantasy, but in the stock. By the universe of Puritan belief, there was no such thing as a harmless fantasy. There was only godly activity and diabolical. Activity. There was no neutral ground. So as the egg white swirled and settled in the water, what did Abigail see? What shape did her desperate, hopeful, bold imagination conjure in those amorphous clouds? The story that would later be told was that she saw a spectre coffin, not a ship's captain or a prosperous farmer, but a symbol of death. The psychological impact of this must have been profound. The initial thrill of the forbidden would have curdled, instantly, into a cold, consuming dread. For a child raised in this culture, where every event was a message from God or Satan, such an omen would not be dismissed as a silly game. It would be received as a terrifying truth. The seed of panic was planted. The first signs were subtle, a nervousness that seemed excessive, a reluctance to be alone, a loss of appetite. Perhaps Betty, the younger and likely more sensitive of the two, began to have trouble sleeping. Plagued by bad dreams, then came the fits. It is crucial that we try to understand these fits not through a modern clinical lens, but through the eyes of those who witnessed them. This was not a quiet anxiety. It was a physical, violent, and deeply shocking spectacle. The girls would suddenly shriek, as if in response to an unseen stimulus. They would contort their bodies into impossible positions, backs arched so severely their heads earned, heels nearly touched, muscles locked rigid. They would cry out that they were being pinched, or stabbed with invisible pins. They would choke and gag, as if an invisible hand were constricting their throats. They would at times fall into a dead, trance-like stupor, unresponsive to the world around them, and then, just as suddenly, they would revert to a trembling, sobbing normality, exhausted and terrified by their own experience. The Paris household was thrown into chaos. Reverend Paris's first recourse, undoubtedly, was prayer, fervent, desperate prayer, but the prayers seemed to have no effect, if anything. The fits grew worse, more frequent, more dramatic. The news could not be contained. In a community this small, this interconnected, and this starved for event, word spread with the speed of a brushfire. Neighbors began to arrive, their faces masks of concern and morbid curiosity. They would gather in the parsonage's main room, a solemn audience to this terrifying performance. They witnessed the girls' throats constrict. They saw their limbs distorted. They heard their ear-splitting cries, and they saw that the ministrations of their minister, God's own representative, were powerless to stop it. The whispers began, not shouts, not accusations, not yet. Whispers, they were the sound of a community trying to process something incomprehensible. They gathered in small knots outside the meeting house, their breath pluming in the cold air. They spoke in low tones behind closed doors they had seen. Illness before fevers, convulsions in infants, the wasting diseases that took so many. But this was different. This had a pattern, a theatricality, a seeming intelligence behind it. It responded to the words of Scripture, often worsening when Psalms were read. The collective memory of the community, the deep cultural substrate of folk belief that existed just beneath the surface of official theology, provided the only available framework for understanding such a phenomenon, witchcraft. Their fear was not an abstract superstition. It was a specific and deeply held belief, supported by law and Scripture. "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live," from Exodus, was a foundational command. Witchcraft, to them, was not a fantasy. It was a real and present danger, a form of maleficium, harmful magic. A witch was an individual who had entered into a covenant with Satan, signing his book in blood, receiving in return the power to afflict their neighbors through supernatural means. These means were often spectral, the witch's spectre, or shape. A kind of astral projection invisible to all but the victim, could travel to pinch, choke, and torment. This explained the invisibility of the attacker. It explained why pious prayer had no effect. This was not an act of God, but of Satan, working through his human agent. The village began to look upon the parsonage not just with pity, but with a new, fearful significance. It was the epicenter of something dark and unnatural. The affliction began to spread. Other young women in the community started to exhibit similar symptoms. And Putnam Jr., 12 years old, a neighbor and friend of the girls, was soon seized by fits. Then Mercy Lewis, 17, his servant in the Putnam household. Then Elizabeth Hubbard, also 17, his servant. Mary Walcott, also 17, the circle of afflicted girls widened. They were grouped now, a cohort bound together by a shared and terrifying secret knowledge. A shared experience that set them apart and made them the absolute focus of the entire villagess. Attention, the reaction was a mixture of terror, fascination, and a desperate need for answers. The community was under attack, but from whom? The invisible world had breached their doors, and the only way to fight an invisible enemy was to make it visible. Pressure began to build on the ministers, on the village elders, on the girls themselves. They must name their tormentors. Who was doing this? Who had sent their spectre to pinch and juke and torture God's children? The question hung in the frosty air, in the silence between the girls' screams, in the worried whispers of every household. It was a question that demanded an answer. And in the charged, paranoid atmosphere of a community already fractured by feud and steeped in a worldview that saw Satan's hand in every misfortune, the first answer, when it finally came, would be like a spark falling onto tinted drywood. The pressure within the parsonage, within the very community itself, had been building like a pot left too long upon the fire. The fits of the afflicted girls were no longer a private tragedy. They were a public spectacle. The home of Reverend Paris became a stage. The girls its frantic performers, and the ever-growing crowd of villagers its horrified, captivated audience. They came not out of ghoulishness alone, but out of a desperate, communal need to understand. To bear witness was to participate in the crisis, to share the burden of this terrifying mystery. And with every visit, the unspoken question grew more deafening in its silence. Who? The answer did not emerge in a single, clear moment. It was prized from the girls in fragments, between choked sobs and convulsive seizures under the intense, fearful scrutiny of the adult's Reverend Paris, his anxious wife. The grim-faced village elders like Thomas Putnam and Joseph Hutchinson, the girls, were pressed, cajoled and prayed over. They were begged, in the name of God, to reveal the source of their torment, to look upon the spectre that was attacking them and to name it. The first name, when it finally came, was whispered. It was a name born of fear, of confusion, and perhaps of a child's instinct for self-preservation. The finger was pointed, tentatively at first, then with increasing certainty, at the most vulnerable, the most other person in the household. Tituba. The accusation hung in the smoky air of the parsonage. It was at once shocking and, in a terrible way, perversely logical. Tituba was the one who had told the stories. She had facilitated the forbidden games. She was an enslaved woman, outside the normal social structures of the village, a person of unknown and therefore suspect loyalties. Her knowledge of a world beyond New England made her a natural conduit for the diabolical. If the devil were to seek an agent within these walls, who better than her? But one name was not enough. The affliction was too great, the spectral attacks too numerous. The girls, now a growing chorus of the afflicted, began to see other shapes looming out of the invisible world. Their torments were the work of a conspiracy, and so other names were dragged into the light. Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne. These were not random choices. In the stark, unforgiving social economy of a Puritan village, reputation was a form of currency, and these three women were bankrupt. Their vulnerability made them perfect candidates for accusation. Sarah Good was a familiar and pitiable sight on the roads of Salem village, destitute, homeless. She wandered from house to house with her pipe clenched between her teeth, begging for handouts, a crust of bread, a night's shelter in a barn. When denied, which was often, she was known to mutter curses under her breath. In a culture that believed words held power, the muttered curse of a disgruntled woman was not taken lightly. She was poor, she was bitter, and she was therefore dangerous. Sarah Osborne was a woman of dubious character in the eyes of the community. She had not attended meeting in over a year, a grave sin of omission. Worse, she had become embroiled in a bitter legal dispute with the Putnam family over the inheritance of her first husband's estate. She had also caused a minor scandal by living with her indentured servant, John Fuller. Before marrying him, she was, in essence, a woman who defied social norms, who challenged male authority, and who had made powerful enemies. Her spiritual and moral standing was already under suspicion. The machinery of the law, slow and ponderous, began to creak into motion on February 29, 1692. Warrants were issued for the arrest of Tituba, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne on the charge of witchcraft. The three women were to be examined publicly. Illegal proceeding designed to uncover the truth through questioning and observation. But this would be no dry, judicial inquiry. It was to be a spiritual and civic drama of the highest order. The venue chosen was the meeting house. On March 1st, the entire village, it seemed, crowded into the frigid, cavernous space. The air was thick with the smell of cold bodies, damp wool, and palpable anxiety. At the center of it all, on display before their neighbors, were the accused, and arrayed against them were the accusers, the circle of afflicted girls, a pitiable and terrifying sight. They were not mere witnesses, they were the primary evidence. The magistrates for the examination were John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin, local men of stature and power. Hathorne, in particular, was a severe, imposing figure. His face set in lines of grim determination. He believed utterly in the reality of the witchcraft. Threat and saw his role not as an impartial arbiter, but as a God-fearing man rooting out a diabolical infection. The examination of Sarah Good was a masterclass in coercive spectacle. When Hathorne turned his stern gaze upon her and demanded, "Sarah Good, what evil spirit have you familiarity with?" he was not asking a question. He was issuing a command for confession. The room fell silent. All eyes were on the ragged woman. But Sarah Good was defiant. She denied it. She denied everything. And then the proof manifested. As she spoke her denial, the afflicted girls Abigail, Betty, and Putnam, Mercy Lewis, were struck down, they writhed. They screamed that Sarah Good's spectre was upon them, pinching them, choking them, their bodies contorted in perfect unison. A synchronized symphony of agony. The message to the crowd was unmistakable. The devil could give his servants the power to lie, but he could not stop their evil essence from torturing these innocents. Their pain was the truth of her guilt. Hawthorne's voice would rise, not in question, but in pronouncement. Echoing in the meeting house, "You see she denies it. Yet you see how the afflicted are tormented. What do you say now? Are you not a witch?" Sarah Osborne's examination followed a similar pattern. Ill and frail, she too denied the charges, and again. The girls provided the evidence. They cried out that they were being attacked by her spectre. They fell into fits at her every movement. Her failure to attend meeting was held up as evidence of her turning away from God and towards Satan. Her contentious nature, her legal battles, all her past sins were now recast not as human failings, but as clues to her diabolical allegiance. But it was the examination of Tituba that truly ignited the inferno. For 2 days she had been held in custody, separated from the Paris household, isolated and terrified. When she was brought before Hathorne and the packed meeting house, the expectation was another denial, another display of spectral evidence from the girls. But Tituba did something entirely unexpected. She confessed. Perhaps she was frightened. Perhaps she saw the futility of denial in the face of the girls' performances. Perhaps, as an enslaved woman, she understood the precariousness of her position better than anyone. Or perhaps, in a stroke of desperate genius, she realized that confession a full, elaborate, and captivating confession was her only path to survival. To confess was to align herself with her authorities, to become a co-operator in the great work of uncovering the devil's plot. And so she began to talk. And what she said held the entire meeting house in rapt, horrified thrall. Her voice, perhaps laced with the cadence of her origins, painted a vivid and terrifying picture for the magistrates and the villagers. She spoke of a tall, dark man from Boston who had come to her. He had brought with him a book, a great, big book. How big? Hathorne would have leaned forward, his voice intense. Tituba would have gestured, her eyes wide. A large book, as big as the larger state Bible. This man, she said, had commanded her to serve him. He had promised her pretty things, relief from her servitude. He had other witches with him, she claimed. She had seen their marks in the book. She had seen the marks of Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne. She spoke of familiars, animal spirits that served the witches, a yellow bird that Sarah Good had fed, a thing with wings and legs and a head like a woman that Sarah Osborne had, a black dog, a red cat, a black cat that Tituba herself had been given. She spoke of riding on sticks through the air. She spoke of signing the book. She spoke of a great gathering of witches. a Sabbat, right there in Salem Village, to plot the destruction of the Puritan community. The effect was electric, every wild, folkloric fear, every theological nightmare preached from the pulpit by Paris and others, was now given substance. Tituba was not just confirming witchcraft. She was revealing its terrifying scope. This was not the work of three isolated, miserable women. This was a vast, organized conspiracy. The invisible world had declared war, and its soldiers were walking among them. The magistrates' voices would have risen in a feverish mix of horror and triumph. How many witches are there? What are their names? Where did they meet Tituba? Now the center of attention, fed the hunger. She spoke more names, but vaguely, tantalizingly. She had seen other marks in the book, but the tall man had obscured them. She had been hurt for not telling more. The message was clear. There were more, many more. The hysteria in the village, once a smouldering ember, was now a roaring blaze. Tituba's confession validated everything. The girls were not hysterics. They were divine instruments, their afflictions a terrible gift that allowed them to see the hidden enemies in their midst. The magistrates were heroes, peeling back the layers of the devil's plot. And the community was indeed besieged. Just as Reverend Paris had been warning them from the pulpit, the first three accused were sent to Boston jail to await trial. But the matter was far from closed. Tituba had opened a door, and through it, the village saw a legion of spectres. The accusations, once begun, could not be contained. The circle of the afflicted widened, and their visions grew ever more elaborate, and the naming of names had only just begun. The hunt was on. The confession of Tituba was the key that unlocked a door the community had feared existed but had never before seen opened. It was not a door to a single closet containing a few maleficent souls. It was a gateway to a hidden world that ran parallel to their own. A world teeming with invisible enemies. The initial, terrifying relief of having identified the source of the evil Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, Tituba was short-lived. For Tituba's testimony had implied a terrifying truth. The conspiracy was vast. The devil's book contained many more names. The witches, she said, had gathered in numbers. The three women in Boston jail were not the generals of this dark army. They were merely its first, ragged recruits. The real threat was still at large, woven into the very fabric of the village. Hiding behind masks of piety and respectability, this notion, once seated, grew with a virulence that outpaced any blight on the wheat or sickness in the livestock. The circle of afflicted girls, now the undisputed oracles of this crisis, found their senses attuned to the spectral world. Their fits, once random and terrifying, became a form of grim liturgy. A ritual of unmasking. Their visions grew more elaborate, more specific. They began to see new spectres, no longer just the ragged and the marginalized, but figures that sent a deeper, more profound shock through the community. The accusations began to climb the social ladder, and with each run ascended, the foundations of Salem Village trembled more violently. The first of these truly shocking accusations was Mother Corey. Goodwife Corey was a full, covenanted member of the church. She was known for her intelligence, her forthrightness, and her piety. She was also known for her skepticism. When the talk of witchcraft first began to swirl, Mother Corey had been dismissive. She questioned the validity of the girls' afflictions, suggesting they might be the product of imagination or, worse, deception. This skepticism, in the feverish atmosphere of the village, was not seen as rational caution. It was seen as a mark of guilt. To question the process was to side with the accused. To side with the accused was to be one of them. Her husband, Giles Corey, a stubborn and contentious old farmer, had added to the suspicion by expressing his own doubts to others, noting that when Martha was away from her spinning wheel, it seemed to operate on its own observation that would later be twisted into damning evidence. When the girls named Martha Corey's spectre as one of their tormentors, the community was divided. Could a church member truly be a witch? The answer, delivered by the magistrates and the afflicted, was a resounding and terrifying yes. The devil, it seemed, could cloak his most effective servants in the garments of righteousness. Martha Corey's examination was a pivotal moment. She maintained a calm and logical demeanor, denying the charges with a confidence that bordered on defiance, but her rationality was no match for the spectral evidence. As she spoke, the girls cried out that her spectre was pinching them. They mimicked her every gesture, claiming she was using her hands to torment them from across the room. When she bit her lip in frustration, they screamed that she was biting them. Her very composure was used against her. It was the cold, calculated demeanor of a seasoned witch, not the frantic fear of an innocent woman. The accusation of Martha Corey shattered a crucial barrier. If she could be a witch, then anyone could. The next accusation struck at the very heart of the village's self-image of piety and family. Rebecca Nurse, Goody Nurse, was 71 years old, a matriarch of a large and respected family. The wife of Francis Nurse, a prominent village farmer and artisan. She was widely known for her devout faith and her gentle, kindly nature. Her reputation was spotless, but reputation, as they were discovering, was a fragile shield against the accusations of the afflicted. The Putnam family, long embroiled in bitter land disputes and personal animosities with the Nurse family, found their grievances now had a new and potent outlet. And Putnam Sr., herself a woman of some standing, and a young daughter, and Junior, became the primary accusers of Rebecca Nurse. The spectacle of Rebecca Nurse's examination was one of profound pathos, frail, hard of hearing, and, likely confused by the cacophony of accusations hurled at her, she presented a pitiable figure. Her soft, bewildered denials were met with a storm of agonized cries from the girls. They fell into fits so violent that magistrates like John Hathorne could only interpret them as divine proof of her guilt. The most damning moment came when the venerable former minister of Salem village, Deodat Lawson, who had returned to witness the proceedings, directly asked the afflicted if they saw Goody Nurse's spectre present. Their simultaneous, convulsive response left no room for doubt in the minds of the onlookers. Here was a woman who embodied Puritan virtue. Now revealed as a servant of Satan, the message was clear. The corruption was so deep that it had festered in the most wholesome of places. The community's fear curdled into a paranoia so absolute that it inverted its own values. Goodness itself became a suspect disguise. Then came the accusation against Elizabeth Proctor. The Proctors were tavern keepers, people of substance and some worldly experience. John Proctor was a blunt, forceful man who had from the beginning denounced the witch trials as a fraud and the girls as liars. He had openly threatened to thrash the Jade Mercy Lewis if she continued her accusations. To accuse Elizabeth was to strike directly at one of the most vocal critics of the entire proceedings. But the method of her accusation revealed a new and chilling evolution in the process. During her examination, John Proctor, who had come to defend his wife, was himself named by the girls his spectre. They shrieked, was there too, tormenting them. The witchcraft was now a contagion that could infect an entire household, turning a critic into a co-conspirator. The Proctor's fate was sealed together. The courtroom, often the meeting house itself, became a theater of the absurd where the rules of evidence were rewritten by the afflicted. The primary proof was spectral evidence, the testimony of the girls that they could see the invisible spectre of the accused committing the acts of torture. This was considered irrefutable. To deny it was to deny the power of God to reveal the devil's work through these afflicted. Children, other tests were devised, physical corroborations of the invisible world. The most infamous was the touch test, if an afflicted person was in the throes of a fit, supposedly caused by the spectre of a specific witch, and that witch was compelled to lay her hands upon the victim, the fit would instantly cease. The logic was that the witch's physical touch broke the power of her spectral projection. The success of this test relied on the power of suggestion and the collusion, conscious or not, of the afflicted. A magistrate would forcibly take the hand of the accused trembling Sarah Good, a bewildered Rebecca Nurse, and press it upon the writhing, shrieking girl. When the girl's fit suddenly subsided into exhausted whimpers, the crowd would gasp, and the magistrates would nod in grim satisfaction. It was proof positive. Confessions remained the most prized evidence, following Tituba's example. Confessing meant aligning oneself with the court, becoming a witness to the grand conspiracy. It offered a path to survival, if not freedom. Those who confessed were not executed. They were kept alive to name more names, to flesh out the details of the devil's plot with their own invented or coerced narratives. The confessions became more elaborate. Feeding the court's hunger for validation, they spoke of witch meetings in Paris's pasture, of sacraments of red bread and blood, of a devil who promised them protection from the wrath of the court. Each confession added another layer of horrifying detail to the story, making it more real and more inescapable for everyone involved. We can imagine the scene through the eyes of a hypothetical villager, a man like Samuel Sewell or Joseph Putnam, sitting in the meeting house, his journal resting on his knee. The air is cold and tense. Before him, on the magistrate's bench, sits Hathorne, his face a mask of stern piety, his voice a weapon. On the stool before him is Rebecca Nurse, looking small and lost, and to the side, the girls Abigail and Mercy are a seething mess of agony. His quill might scratch in his diary. March 24th. The examination of Rebecca Nurse, a most grievous sight. The magistrates urgent with her to confess. She denies. Hathorne asks if she hath not had familiarity with Satan. She says, "No, sir, I have none but with God alone." At this, the children are struck dumb as if duped. Then cry out most piteously that her sheep doth press upon their breasts. They see her upon the beam, they say, and a black man whispering in her ear. She looks about, bewildered, and says she sees nothing. Her confusion is taken for guile. When old George Jacobs is brought in, the children fall down as if dead, and only revive when his staff is taken from him and laid upon them. I know not what to think. The evidence of the eyes is powerful, yet my heart is heavy. Can it be that such a woman, so old in years and in faith, should be in league with the enemy? The world is turned upside down. The accusations were no longer just about resolving personal grudges or explaining inexplicable illnesses. They had become a self-sustaining engine of fear. Each rest demanded more rests. Each confession revealed a wider conspiracy. Each execution created new ghosts whose spectres could then be seen by the afflicted, demanding yet more rests. The community was caught in a feedback loop of its own creation, where the only way to prove the initial premise was true was to find more evidence of it. And the only evidence accepted was that which confirmed the premise. The logic was airtight, and it was hurtling them toward the gallows. The world of substance and reason had receded. And now they lived in a world of spectres, where the most believable truth was the most terrifying nightmare. The confession of Tituba was the key that unlocked a door the community had feared existed but had never before seen opened. It was not a door to a single closet containing a few maleficent souls. It was a gateway to a hidden world that ran parallel to their own, a world teeming with invisible enemies. The initial, terrifying relief of having identified the source of the evil Sarah Good. Sarah Osborne. Tituba was short-lived, for Tituba's testimony had implied a terrifying truth. The conspiracy was vast. The Devil's Book contained many more names. The witches, she said, had gathered in numbers. The 3 women in Boston jail were not the generals of this dark army. They were merely its first, ragged recruits. The real threat was still at large, woven into the very fabric of the village, hiding behind masks of piety and respectability. This notion, once seated, grew with a virulence that outpaced any blight on the wheat or sickness in the livestock. The circle of afflicted girls, now the undisputed oracles of this crisis, found their senses attuned to the spectral world. Their fits, once random and terrifying, became a form of grim liturgy, a ritual of unmasking. And their visions grew more elaborate, more specific. They began to see new spectres, no longer just the ragged and the marginalized, but figures that sent a deeper, more profound shock through the community. The accusations began to climb the social ladder, and with each rung ascended, the foundations of Salem village trembled more violently. The first of these truly shocking accusations was Mother Corey. Goodwife Corey was a full, covenanted member of the church. She was known for her intelligence, her forthrightness, and her piety. She was also known for her skepticism. When the talk of witchcraft first began to swirl, Mother Corey had been dismissive. She questioned the validity of the girls' afflictions, suggesting they might be the product of imagination or, worse, deception. This skepticism, in the feverish atmosphere of the village, was not seen as rational caution. It was seen as a mark of guilt. To question the process was to side with the accused. To side with the accused was to be one of them. Her husband, Giles Corey, a stubborn and contentious old farmer, had added to the suspicion by expressing his own doubts to others, noting that when Martha was away from her spinning wheel, it seemed to operate on its own observation that would later be twisted into damning evidence. When the girls named Martha Corey's spectre as one of their tormentors, the community was divided. Could a church member truly be a witch? The answer, delivered by the magistrates and the afflicted, was a resounding and terrifying yes. The devil, it seemed, could cloak his most effective servants in the garments of righteousness. Martha Corey's examination was a pivotal moment. She maintained a calm and logical demeanor, denying the charges with a confidence that bordered on defiance, but her rationality was no match. For the spectral evidence, as she spoke, the girls cried out that her spectre was pinching them. They mimicked her every gesture, claiming she was using her hands to torment them from across the room. When she bit her lip in frustration, they screamed that she was biting them. Her very composure was used against her. It was the cold, calculated demeanor of a seasoned witch, not the frantic fear of an innocent woman. The accusation of Martha Corey shattered a crucial barrier. If she could be a witch, then anyone could. The next accusation struck at the very heart of the village's self-image of piety and family. Rebecca Nurse. Goody Nurse was 71 years old, a matriarch of a large and respected family, the wife of Francis Nurse, a prominent village farmer and artisan. She was widely known for her devout faith and her gentle, kindly nature. Her reputation was spotless. But reputation, as they were discovering, was a fragile shield against the accusations of the afflicted. The Putnam family, long embroiled in bitterland disputes and personal animosities with the Nurse family, found their grievances now had a new and potent outlet. And Putnam Sr., herself a woman of some standing, and a young daughter, and Junior, became the primary accusers of Rebecca Nurse. The spectacle of Rebecca Nurse's examination was one of profound pathos. Frail, hard of hearing, and, likely confused by the cacophony of accusations hurled at her, she presented a pitiable figure. Her soft, bewildered denials were met with a storm of agonized cries from the girls. They fell into fits so violent that magistrates like John Hathorne could only interpret them as divine proof of her guilt. The most damning moment came when the venerable former minister of Salem Village, Deodat Lawson, who had returned to witness the proceedings, directly asked the afflicted if they saw Goody Nurse's spectre present. Their simultaneous, convulsive response left no room for a doubt in the minds of the onlookers. Here was a woman who embodied Puritan virtue, now revealed as a servant of Satan. The message was clear. The corruption was so deep that it had festered in the most wholesome of places. The community's fear curdled into a paranoia so absolute that it inverted its own values. Goodness itself became a suspect disguise. Then came the accusation against Elizabeth Proctor. The Proctors were tavern keepers, people of substance and some worldly experience. John Proctor was a blunt, forceful man who had from the beginning denounced the witch trials as a fraud and the girls as liars. He had openly threatened to thrash the Jade Mercy Lewis if she continued her accusations. To accuse Elizabeth was to strike directly at one of the most vocal critics of the entire proceedings. But the method of her accusation revealed a new and chilling evolution in the process. During her examination, John Proctor, who had come to defend his wife, was himself named by the girls. His spectre, they shrieked, was there too, tormenting them. The witchcraft was now a contagion that could infect an entire household, turning a critic into a co-conspirator. The Proctor's fate was sealed together. The accusations were no longer a linear progression. They were a wildfire, spreading in every direction, fanned by the winds of suspicion and paranoia, consuming everything in its path: neighbors, families, the wealthy, the pious, the powerful. The village, and soon the entire region, was plunged into a waking nightmare where the only constant was the terror of a pointing finger. The circle of the afflicted, the visionary girls, had become the central authority in the colony. Their power was absolute. Their fits were no longer mere symptoms, they were oracular pronouncements. A shriek in the meeting house, a convulsion in the street. A choked whisper naming a name, these were all it took to set the machinery of rest in motion. Their ranks had swelled. Alongside Abigail Williams and Putnam Jr., Mercy Lewis, Elizabeth Hubbard, and Mary Walcott, now stood Mary Warren, the servant of John and Elizabeth Proctor, and Susanna Sheldon and others. They were a constant, terrifying presence, escorted to every examination. Their agony is the primary evidence of guilt. They developed a kind of horrific choreography, their torments mirroring each other, their voices rising in a unified chorus of accusation. They saw spectres everywhere, perched on the meeting-house beams, floating in the air, sitting beside the accused on the magistrate's bench itself. The atmosphere inside the meeting-house during a preliminary examination was a potent mixture of religious fervor, judicial proceeding, and theatrical spectacle. The room would be packed to the rafters, the air thick and foul with the smell of unwashed bodies. Damp wool and palpable dread. Farmers, their work forgotten, jostled with merchants from Salem town who had come to witness the strange happenings. Women clutched their children close, their faces pale with a fear that was both for their own safety and for the state of their immortal souls. At the front, on a raised platform, sat the magistrates, John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin, their faces grave, their voices carrying the weight of divine and temporal authority. They were not impartial judges, they were inquisitors, their questions designed not to uncover objective truth, but to confirm the spectral reality presented by the afflicted. And in the center of it all, on a low stool, sat the accused. Isolated, exposed, they faced a wall of hostile, fearful faces. The proceedings were a form of psychological torture. The magistrates would begin with a stern command. Look upon the afflicted. Why do you hurt these children? As the accused would deny the charge, the girls would erupt. They would scream that the accused spectre was upon them, pinching, choking. Stabbing them with invisible pins, they would collapse. Their bodies contorting into impossible shapes, their cries echoing off the meeting house walls. The magistrates would then turn back to the accused, their voices rising in triumph. You see your effect. What do you say to this? Are you not a witch? The accused were trapped in a diabolical logic. Denial was met with intensified fits, which were taken as proof of guilt. Any display of emotion, fear, anger, frustration was also proof. If they wept, it was the devil's sorrow. If they grew angry, it was the devil's malice. If they remained calm, it was the devil's cold cunning. There was no correct response. The only hope was confession. To confess was to join the narrative, to become a co-operator, to name other names and thus spy one's life, though not one's freedom. The jails in Salem, Boston, and Ipswich began to overflow. Over 100 people were arrested, from Salem Village and Salem Town, from Ipswich, from Topsfield, from Andover. The social fabric of Essex County was being systematically torn apart. This was no longer about settling old scores over land or livestock, though those animosities certainly provided the kindling. This was about a fundamental breakdown of trust. The world had become utterly unreliable. A friendly glance could be a witch's glamour. A neighbor's offer of help could be a satanic ploy. Fear divided families with a cruelty that was both intimate and profound. Edward Bishop's tavern, an own gathering place for skeptics, saw his own wife, Sarah Bishop, accused and arrested. The Porter family, allies of the Putnams, found themselves accused by their own neighbors. The most devastating familial fracture was within. The Putnam household, and Putnam Sr., a woman of considerable influence, not only supported her daughter's accusations, but began to have spectral visions of her own. She became one of the most prolific accusers, targeting, among others, the revered Rebecca Nurse. This pitted the Putnam family directly against the Nurse family. A feud that now played out not in land courts, but in a courtroom of life and death. The case of George Burroughs, however, demonstrated how far the net had been cast. Burroughs was a former minister of Salem Village, a man who had left years earlier under a cloud of debt and disagreement. He was now living in Wells, Maine, far from the epicenter of the panic. Yet the accusations reached him. Mercy Lewis, his servant in the Putnam household who had once lived in Burroughs's home in Maine, began to see his spectre. She and Putnam Jr. claimed he had bewitched soldiers during Indian attacks and that he was the black-clad minister who presided over the witches' sabbaths in the pasture. To accuse a minister was to strike at the very head of the Puritan body politic. It was an almost unthinkable act, yet it was done. Burroughs was arrested and brought back to Salem in chains. His presence a shocking validation of the belief that the conspiracy was vast, sophisticated, and led by a perversion of God's own ministry. The legal system was utterly overwhelmed and complicit. The new governor, Sir William Phipps, upon his arrival in May, found the colony in chaos. Desperate to bring order, he established a special court of oyer and terminer to hear and determine to try the backlog of cases. Presiding over this court was Lieutenant Governor William Stoughton, a man of deep piety and utter conviction in the reality of witchcraft and the validity of spectral evidence. With him sat a panel of judges, including John Hathorne and Samuel Sewell. The trials themselves were swift and brutal. The rules of evidence were skewed entirely in favor of the accusers. Spectral evidence was not only admitted, it was paramount. The devil could not assume the shape of an innocent person, was the perverse logic adopted by the court. Therefore, if a girl swore she saw your spectre tormenting her, you were guilty. Your own protestations of innocence were irrelevant. They were just the devil lying through you. The atmosphere in Salem during that summer was one of collective psychosis, the ordinary rhythms of life planting, tending, trading ground to a halt. The air hummed with gossip and fear. People spoke in hushed tones, afraid of who might be listening, both seen and unseen. The sight of the marshal and his constables riding down the road would send a wave of panic through the community. Who would they take next? It could be anyone. The tavern keeper who had argued about a bill. The wife who had bested you in a trade. The wealthy man whose land you coveted. The pious woman whose goodness now seemed like a mask. The world had been inverted. The trusted had become treacherous. The familiar had become alien. And the only thing that was certain was the spectre that haunted every shadow, every conversation, every solitary thought. The community, founded on a principle of unity in the face of a hostile wilderness, had now turned its hostility inward, devouring itself in a desperate, self-destructive attempt to purge an invisible enemy that grew more numerous with every life it consumed. The gallows on the rocky prominence known as Gallows Hill waited, a stark and grim silhouette against the summer sky, a promise of a terrible and final solution. The machinery of the court of Oyer and Termina, once set in motion, moved with a grim and relentless efficiency. The spectral evidence, the coerced confessions, the theatrical agonies of the afflicted all had been deemed sufficient. The verdicts were foregone. Conclusions, and so, in the heat of a New England summer, the colony of Massachusetts Bay began the business of killing its own. The transition from accusation to execution was a solemn, terrifying process, marked not by rabid bloodlust, but by a chilling, ceremonial gravity. This was not murder. It was, in the eyes of the authorities and many of the onlookers, a sacred duty of purification. A grim necessity to save the community from the infernal plague that had infected it. The air, thick with the humidity of the season, grew heavier still with the weight of impending death. The first to be tried was Bridget Bishop. She was an easy target, a woman whose life had long been a subject of gossip and suspicion. She ran a tavern in Salem town where patrons could drink ale and play shuffleboard, activities that strict Puritans viewed as licentious and ungodly. She was known for her flashy, redundant clothing, a black cap and a red bodice which set her apart from the drab, somber attire of her neighbors. Her independence and defiance of social norms made her a perfect candidate for the first execution. It would be a powerful statement. The court was not afraid to act, and even the most flamboyant of the devil's servants would be rooted out. On June 10, 1692, Bridget Bishop was carted the few miles from the Salem jail to the place of execution. The site was not the prominent hill we now call Gallows Hill. Recent historical and archaeological evidence points to lower, rocky outcrop at the base of that hill, a place known as Proctor's Ledge, named for the family whose land it abutted. The same family that would soon provide its own martyrs to the cause. It was chosen for its proximity to the jail and because it was visible from the main thoroughfares, a grim warning to all. But it was also tucked away, a place of shame, not spectacle. To stand there today is to stand in a quiet, residential neighborhood, but to imagine it then is to feel a deep sense of dread. The ledge itself was a bare, granite outcrop, scarred by ancient glaciers, upon which a simple gallows could be erected. Below it, the ground fell away into a tangle of brush and rock, where the bodies would be disposed of, denied the sanctity of consecrated ground. The air on June 10th would have been thick and humid, carrying the scent of pine and salt from the nearby coast. A large crowd had gathered, but this was not a mob baying for blood. The atmosphere was likely one of terrified solemnity, a collective, fearful witnessing of a necessary, awful duty. There would have been ministers, their faces stern, ready to exhort the condemned to a last-minute confession. The only way to save her soul since her body was forfeit. There would have been the magistrates and officials, affirming the power of the state, and there would have been the ordinary people of Salem, watching, their hearts likely a turbulency of fear, belief, pity, and a desperate hope that this death would be the one to break the devil's power. They would have stood in clusters, families together, their Sunday best clothes feeling like shrouds in the oppressive heat, their voices hushed to a whisper. The only sounds would be the creak of the cart, the snorting of the horse, the buzz of insects in the summer air, and the distant, forlorn cry of a gull. Bridget Bishop was brought to the ledge. She maintained her innocence too. The noose was placed round her neck, the rough hemp a brutal contrast to the fine fabrics she was known for. The cart she stood upon was pulled away, and the life of Bridget Bishop was extinguished. Her body was likely shoved into a shallow, rocky crevice, denied Christian burial in consecrated ground. A final indignity for a soul believed to belong to Satan. The crowd dispersed. Returning to their homes, they waited, and the afflictions did not stop. The girls still saw spectres. The hangings had to continue. The failure of this first execution to end the crisis only deepened the collective anxiety, making the next round of deaths feel even more urgently necessary. 5 weeks later, on July 19th, the cart made the journey again. This time it carried 5 people: Sarah Good, Sarah Wilds, Elizabeth Howe, Susanna Martin, and Rebecca Nurse. The journey from the jail to the ledge was a procession of profound horror. To be carted through the streets you had known your whole life, past the faces of neighbors, friends, and enemies, to a place of public death, is an agony almost beyond comprehension. The 5 women would have been helped onto the cart, their hands bound, their faces pale masks of fear, defiance, or resigned piety. The driver would click his tongue, and the wheels would begin to turn, each revolution a hammer blow counting down the remaining moments of their lives. Let us consider these individuals not as names in a history, but as people in their final moments. Sarah Good, the destitute beggar, had nothing left but her defiance. From the cart, she was harangued by the Reverend Nicholas Noyes, who demanded she confess. A response, born of a lifetime of hardship and a final, furious injustice, has echoed through history. She fired back, "I am no more a witch than you're a wizard, and if you take away my life, God will give you blood to drink." It was a curse from the scaffold, a final, potent act of agency from a woman who had never had any. The words would haunt Noyes for the rest of his days, his spectral torment of his own. And then there was Rebecca Nurse. Her case had almost derailed the proceedings. At a trial, the jury had initially returned a verdict of not guilty. The outcry from the accusers and the crowd was immediate and violent. Chief Justice Stoughton, in a breathtaking judicial override, asked the jury to reconsider a piece of testimony that Rebecca Nurse had allegedly given her assent to the actions of another witch. The jury changed their verdict to guilty. Even then, Governor Phipps had been persuaded to grant her reprieve, but it was quickly rescinded after another outcry. Now, this 71-year-old woman, frail, pious, and beloved by many, was being carried to the gallows. Her dignity in the face of this monstrous injustice was itself a silent, powerful testimony. One can imagine her, perhaps praying quietly, her mind turned away from the hateful world toward a God she still trusted for ultimate justice. It is said that as she stood on the ladder, she was urged to confess by a minister, perhaps in a genuine, if misguided, attempt to save her soul. Her reply was simple, unwavering, and devastating. I cannot. I am innocent. The 5 women were hanged together. The process would have been slow, a public strangulation. Their bodies were disposed of in the same rough, unceremonious manner as bishops, tumbled into the rocky clefts below the ledge. The community had performed its grim duty, sacrificing 5 of its members to appease the terror. Yet still, the afflictions continued, the spectres did not vanish, the hangings had not cleansed the land. They had only fertilized it with innocent blood, and the harvest was more fear, more accusations and adorning. Horrifying sense that the process itself might be flawed, the greatest blow to the credibility of. The proceedings came on August 19th. Among the 5 hanged on that day were 2 of the most respected and unwavering figures, John Proctor and the Reverend George Burroughs. Proctor, the blunt, courageous farmer who had denounced the trials from the start, went to his death defiant. From prison, he had written a desperate plea to the Boston ministers, begging them to move the trials to Boston or replace the judges, describing the afflicted girls as juggling devils whose accusations were believed over the gospel words of the accused. His plea was ignored. His final act was to draft a will, leaving his estate to his pregnant wife, Elizabeth, who was also condemned but spared execution because of her pregnancy. It was a last, pragmatic act of care in a world gone mad. His last words are lost to history, but his posture was one of unbroken defiance against the madness that consumed his community. The execution of George Burroughs, the former minister, was a moment of supreme horror and, for a moment, profound doubt. As he stood on the ladder, he addressed the crowd with a calm and powerful voice. Then he did the unthinkable. He recited the Lord's Prayer perfectly. This was considered impossible for a witch, as it was believed the devil would not allow his servants to utter such a holy prayer without making a mistake. His words were so powerful, so flawless, that a murmur of uncertainty rippled through the crowd. For a moment, it seemed the spell might be broken. The hangman hesitated. The crowd stirred. Some began to cry out that it was a sign of his innocence. But then, from the crowd, Cotton Mather, the brilliant, zealous young minister from Boston who had come to observe and legitimize the proceedings, rode forward on his horse. He reassured the people. The devil, he declared, could often transform himself into an angel of light. This was merely Satan's final, most cunning deception. The crowd, swayed by his authority and their own ingrained fear, fell silent. The execution proceeded. As he died, it was said Burroughs's body was thrown into a grave alongside the others, but his chin and one hand remained exposed. A final, macabre image of unrest, a silent protest against the injustice that refused to be buried. The hangings on September 22nd Martha Corey, Mary Easty, Alice Parker, Amputator, and Mary Park Rowley deepened the sense of grim routine. Martha Corey, the intelligent, skeptical church member, went to her death maintaining her innocence, but it was Mary Easty, sister of Rebecca Nurse, who, in the moments before her death, performed one of the most courageous acts of the entire tragedy. She penned a humble, dignified petition to the court. She did not rage or curse. She accepted her fate. But she pleaded that no more lives be taken based on the evidence of the afflicted, arguing that they must be deceived, for she knew herself to be innocent. Her words were a powerful, posthumous indictment of the process, a final attempt to stop the madness even as she became its victim. "I know you cannot admit the testimony of a condemned witch," she wrote, with heartbreaking logic. "But I know there is a God of mercy that will one day reveal the truth." The ledge at the foot of the hill had received 19 bodies. Giles Corey, pressed to death 3 days earlier for refusing to enter a plea, was buried elsewhere. The community was not purged, it was traumatized. The air, which the hangings were supposed to cleanse, was now thick with the ghosts of the innocent. Each execution, rather than proving the court's power, had only revealed its terrible fallibility. The gallows had not ended the nightmare. It had only made it more real, more permanent, and more suffocating. The blood that Sarah Good promised was now soaking into the rocky soil of Proctor's Ledge, and a deep, dreadful silence began to descend. A silence far more terrifying than the screams of the afflicted had ever been. It was the silence of a community beginning, slowly and horribly, to realize what it had done. It was the silence of a terrible price about to be paid, not by the accused, but by the accusers. The spectres that haunted Salem were no longer just the inventions of frightened girls. They were the very real, very heavy memories of the men and women who had been sent to their deaths by a court that could not see its own reflection in the shadow of the gallows tree. A parallel drama of suffering was unfolding in the shadows, away from the public spectacle. The jails of Essex County became the overflowing reservoirs of the crisis, holding the accused in a state of suspended animation between life and death. The system, designed for a handful of drunks, thieves, and debtors, was utterly overwhelmed. Over 150 people from Salem and 22 other towns were now enmeshed in the legal nightmare. They were crammed into dungeons, cellars, and fortified houses that served as makeshift prisons, their lives reduced to a desperate, grinding struggle for survival, awaiting a fate that seemed both inevitable and terrifyingly arbitrary. The primary jail was in Salem town, a stout, grim building of stone and timber. Its small, dark cells, designed for a few occupants, now held dozens. The air inside would have been a foul miasma, a thick stew of human waste, unwashed bodies, damp stone, and the sour smell of fear. There was little light, less fresh air, and minimal sanitation. The prisoners were kept in heavy iron leg irons and manacles, their chains scraping against the stone floors, a constant, grim soundtrack to their incarceration. The weight of the iron was not just physical, it was a psychological anchor, a constant reminder of their powerlessness. The food was scant, and poor often just hard bread and water, and families had to bribe jailers to provide anything more substantial. Disease, typhus, dysentery stalked the crowded, filthy conditions. For the elderly and the infirm, like Rebecca Nurse before her execution, the jail itself was a death sentence. The human cost within these walls was immense. We can imagine the scene through the eyes of a visitor, perhaps a family member bringing a meager parcel of food. The descent into the basement of the Salem jail was a descent into a kind of hell. The gloom was pierced only by a single, high window, its bars casting long shadows. In the corner, an elderly woman, once a pillar of her church, now sat on a pile of filthy straw, her mind retreating into a catatonic stupor, whispering psalms to herself. Across the cell, a younger woman, her dress torn and stained, rocked back and forth, her chains clinking rhythmically, her eyes wide with a terror that had long since passed beyond screaming. The sound of weeping was constant, a low, hopeless undercurrent, and through it all, the jailers moved with a rough, indifferent efficiency, their keys jangling like discordant bells. The crisis spilled beyond Salem. Jails in Boston, Ipswich, and Cambridge swelled with the accused from Andover, Topsfield, and Reading. The journey to these distant prisons was itself an ordeal. Accused witches were paraded through the countryside on horseback, their hands bound, a spectacle for every village they passed. In Boston, The infamous prison in the heart of the town became a tourist attraction of sorts. Curious and horrified citizens would peer through the bars at the supposed servants of Satan. Within, the fear was no longer localized. It had become a regional contagion. A rumor in Ipswich could lead to unrest in Marblehead. The very geography of safety had collapsed. Nowhere in Massachusetts felt beyond the reach of the accusing finger. Amidst the sea of suffering, one story stands apart for its unique and horrifying defiance, that of Giles Corey. Corey was an 81-year-old farmer from the Salem village outskirts, a man known for his strength, his stubbornness, and his contentious nature. He was the husband of Martha Corey, already hanged on September 22nd, initially a supporter of the trials. Giles had turned skeptical, then openly critical. After his wife's arrest, he was soon accused himself. Likely for his outspoken opposition, Giles Corey made a calculated decision. He knew the court would seize his property upon a conviction, leaving nothing for his heirs. He also knew that a condemned person's estate was subject to forfeiture. So, he chose a path of ultimate resistance. When brought before the court, he refused to enter a plea under English common law. A defendant who stood mute could not be tried. To force the issue, the law prescribed a brutal remedy, peine forte pressing to death. The sentence was carried out on September 19, 1692, in a field near the Salem jail. It was a public event, designed to break his will. Then, one by one, large stones were piled onto the board. The sheriff, George Corwin, would periodically lean down, demanding that Corey enter a plea. More weight was the old man's only legendary reply. It was not a cry of pain, but a command. It was the last act of agency left to him, to control the manner of his own death and to protect his property for his children. The process was slow, agonizing, and profoundly shocking. It took 2 days for Giles Corey to die. His ribs snapped. His body was slowly crushed. His tongue swelled and was forced from his mouth. Tradition says the sheriff used his cane to push it back in. The spectacle was so gruesome that it reportedly shook the confidence of some spectators. Here was not the passive acceptance of the gallows, but an active, stubborn, and physical defiance that laid bare the brutal reality of the court's power. Corey's death was a silent, crushing rebuke to the entire proceedings. Life in Salem village during that summer and fall had ceased to be normal. It was a society in a state of suspended animation. The harvest, that most crucial of seasonal rhythms, was neglected. Fields lay fallow, not for want of seed, but for want of hands to till them. Men were in jail, or afraid to leave their homes for fear of being accused. The economy ground to a halt. Who would buy from a merchant whose wife was accused? Who would trade with a farmer whose son was in chains? The social bonds that held the community together, the mutual obligations of neighborliness, the shared labor of harvest. The simple acts of borrowing a tool or sharing a meal were severed. Trust was an extinct currency. Even the ministry was fractured. While some ministers like Cotton Mather and Nicholas Noyes fervently supported the court, others grew increasingly uneasy. The Reverend Francis Dane of Andover, seeing his own town consumed by the hysteria, began to openly question the proceedings. The Reverend John Hale Beverly, who had initially been a firm believer in the witch hunt, witnessed the hanging of his friend John Proctor and the horrific death of Giles Corey, and a deep, troubling doubt began to gnaw at his conscience. These clerical doubts were quiet, often private, but they were significant cracks in the theological foundation that supported the trials. The fear was now a two-way street. The accusers feared the specters of the accused. But the accused and their families, and the growing number of silent skeptics, now feared the accusers, the magistrates, the sheriff, and their own neighbors. It was a community paralyzed by mutual terror. The laughter of children playing was no longer a joyful noise. It was a reminder of the girls whose visions could destroy life. The meeting house, once the center of spiritual life, was now the stage for the examinations, its sanctity polluted by the proceedings. Every aspect of daily life was poisoned by the pervasive, all-consuming fear. Salem had become a place where the only thriving industry was accusation, and the only guaranteed harvest was despair. The community had built its own prison, not of stone and iron, but of suspicion and dread, and every single soul within its bounds was now a prisoner. The summer of 1690 had been a season of fire and iron, a time of absolute, terrifying certainty. The path was clear. Identify the witches. Try them with the evidence God had provided through the afflicted, and purge the land of the devil's influence. But as the autumn leaves began to blaze and then wither, a new, more insidious element began to seep into the collective consciousness of Massachusetts Bay, chilling the fervor that had burned so hot. It was the slow, cold drip of doubt. It did not rise as a single, thunderous revelation, but as a series of quiet realizations, whispered questions, and intellectual challenges that, like water on stone, began to wear away the foundations of the witch hunt. The hangings had not brought peace. They had only multiplied the ghosts. The confessions had not mapped a finite conspiracy, but had instead revealed an ever-expanding, logically impossible network of evil that now implicated the highest echelons of society. The very success of the hunt was beginning to reveal its own grotesque absurdity. The most potent and legitimate challenge to the court's authority came not from the lay people in the lanes of Salem, but from within the sanctified and scholarly walls of the Boston ministry, while local parish priests like the vehement Nicholas Noyes of Salem town remained staunch supporters. A powerful intellectual opposition was coalescing in the colony's capital, led by its most esteemed divine, Increase Mather, the president of Harvard College, a man of immense learning, deep piety, and immense political influence. Mather watched the escalating horror with a scholar's growing alarm and a pastor's dread. His concern laser-focused on the court's utter and near-exclusive reliance on spectral evidence, the testimony of the afflicted, that they could see the invisible spectre of the accused committing the malefic acts to Mather and a growing number of his colleagues. This was a theologically rotten and judicially catastrophic foundation for taking human life. The debate, it is crucial to understand, was not over the existence of witchcraft on that. Everyone from the lowliest farmer to the most learned divine was in agreement. The debate was over the devil's nature and his power to deceive in his study. Surrounded by volumes of theology and law, Increase Mather, with his son Cotton Mather, whose own fervent belief in the witch threat was now being tempered and complicated by his father's rigorous logic and other concerned ministers, began to formulate a devastatingly simple argument. They pored over scripture and the works of European demonologists, searching for precedent. The result was a treatise that would become a death knell for the trials, cases of conscience concerning evil spirits, personality men, published in October 1692, with meticulous, scholarly precision. Mather laid out the case. He argued that while the devil could not assume the shape of a truly godly person without their consent, he was, by his very title, the deceiver. It is better, he wrote, in words that would echo through the colony with the force of Scripture, that 10 suspected witches should escape, than that one innocent person should be condemned. This was a direct and stunning repudiation of the court's core methodology, which had operated on the opposite principle. He further argued that to allow spectral evidence as the primary proof was to hand the ultimate power of life and death to the father of lies. If the devil could manipulate the visions of the afflicted girls, and why would he not, when it suited his chaotic purposes? Then he could direct them against the most innocent person in the colony. The court, in its zeal to fight Satan, had potentially become his unwitting instrument, its judges mere puppets pulling the ropes on the devil's own gallows. This theologically robust critique from such an unimpeachable source was an earthquake. It gave voice to the unspoken fears of many and provided intellectual and spiritual cover for those who had begun to doubt, but feared that expressing skepticism was itself a sign of spectral seduction. The mothers were not radicals, they were the establishment. Their skepticism could not be dismissed as sympathy for witches or lack of piety. It was a reasoned argument from within the heart of Puritan orthodoxy itself, and it forced a moment of terrible reckoning. Simultaneously, the sheer momentum of the accusations began to undermine their own credibility through sheer overreach. The spectres had initially targeted a plausible roster of suspects: the poor, the contentious, the marginalized people whose guilt, to a fearful and superstitious mind, made a dark kind of sense. But the net had widened to encompass figures of unimpeachable character and status. The execution of Rebecca Nurse, a pious matriarch, had already caused severe disquiet. The hanging of George Burroughs, an ordained minister, was a shock that reverberated across New England. But then the accusations climbed higher still, into the very pinnacle of colonial power. Lady Mary Phipps, the wife of Governor Sir William Phipps, was whispered about the spectres. It seemed, when out targeting the governor's own household, this changed everything. For the merchant and political classes in Boston, the abstract threat of witchcraft suddenly became a tangible threat to the social order, to property rights, and to their own personal safety. It was one thing to hang a beggar like Sarah Good. It was quite another to entertain the idea of investigating, let alone executing, the governor's wife. The fear, which had once flowed in one direction, now began to flow back toward the accusers. The powerful men of the colony realized that no one was safe. The witch hunt was no longer a tool for enforcing order. It had become the greatest threat to order. Furthermore, the methods of the court, once seen as divinely inspired, began to appear under this new skeptical light as a grotesque and manipulable parody of justice, the touch test, where the hand of the accused was forced upon a writhing afflicted person to instantly break the fet, worked with flawless, theatrical precision every single time, regardless of who was touched. A quiet observer could begin to wonder if the cure was not supernatural, but a simple act of psychological suggestion, a prearranged signal for the performance to end. The confessions, once so prized for the horrifying detail they provided, grew increasingly ludicrous and contradictory under scrutiny. Accused witches from Salem village described grand witch meetings in Paris's pasture with a black-clad minister. Those from Andover described entirely different sabbats in different locations with different leaders. The devil's conspiracy, it seemed, was disorganized and suffered from poor internal communication. The sheer number of the accused, over 150 people from dozens of towns, began to defy all plausibility. Could Satan's recruitment drive in New England really be so spectacularly, undeniably successful? Was the entire colony, aside from the accusing girls and the judges, utterly brimming with servants of the devil? The arithmetic of evil no longer added up. The mood in Salem and Boston began to shift palpably. The public examinations, once packed with fearful and approving crowds, now began to feature more silent, grim-faced spectators. The cheers of support turned to uneasy murmurs. The performance was the same, but the audience's suspension of disbelief was crumbling. When a respected and wealthy merchant like Philip English was accused, the business community took grave notice. Trade was suffering. Estates were being seized and left fallow. The economic and social disruption caused by the trials was becoming too great to bear. The fields were untended, the shops were half empty, and a pall of mistrust crippled every commercial and social transaction. Governor Sir William Phipps, a man of action and ambition more than deep intellect, found himself in an impossible position. He had initially returned from a military campaign to a colony in chaos and had empowered the Court of Oyer and Termina under Stoughton to bring order. Instead, the court had created bedlam. He was now facing a perfect storm: the formidable intellectual opposition of increased Mather, the growing economic concerns of the merchant class, the terrifying personal threat to his own wife, and the rising tide of public unease. The pressure to act was immense. In late October, the governor made his move. He did not outright condemn the court, but he effectively pulled its teeth. He first issued an order that spectral evidence would no longer be admissible as the sole basis for a conviction. This single act dismantled the entire engine of the prosecutions. Without the testimony of the afflicted about their invisible torments, the cases against most of the accused evaporated into hearsay, old grudges, and superstitious gossip. Then, a few weeks later, he suspended the Court of Oyer and Termina. The special court, created for this specific purpose, was dissolved. The gallows, which had claimed 19 lives and 1 pressed man, would see no more victims from Salem. The effect was immediate and profound. A collective exhale held for months. For the accused still languishing in the nightmarish jails, it was a reprieve. A gasp of clean air after months of suffocating dread. For the circle of afflicted girls, it was a terrifying and confusing loss of power and purpose. Their visions, once the most potent force in the colony, was suddenly stripped of all legal authority, rendered mere curiosities or symptoms of hysteria. For the judges and ardent accusers, it was a moment of profound confusion, defensive anger, and creeping shame. For the community at large, it was the beginning of a long, painful, and shameful hangover. The storm of panic had not passed because the devil had been defeated. It had passed because men in power had finally decided to stop believing the stories. The cessation of the trials was not a moment of triumph, but one of profound and disorienting silence. The certainties of the summer were gone. If the spectres were not real, then what had they been doing? If the girls were not truthful, then what was the nature of their fits? If the condemned were innocent, then what did that make the executioners, the judges, the accusers, the witnesses? The questions that began to swirl in the crisp autumn air were far more terrifying than any spectre. They were questions about guilt, complicity, and a terrible, collective mistake. The external enemy had vanished, and the community was left utterly alone to face the enemy within, the horrifying reality of what they had done and who they had become. The hunting was over. The reckoning was about to begin. The suspension of the Court of Oyer and Termina in the fall of 1692 did not bring a swift, clean end to the nightmare. It was not a curtain falling on a concluded play, but a sudden, jarring cessation of noise, leaving behind a reigning, painful silence in which the community was forced to survey the wreckage. The machinery of the hunt had ground to a halt, but its victims remained in the jails, in the unmarked graves, and in the shattered homes where the echoes of accusation would linger for generations. The aftermath was a season of slow, agonizing, and incomplete reckoning, a time of shame, poverty, and a stigma that clung to families like a foul odor, long after the prison doors had swung open. The release of the prisoners was not a triumphant procession, but a furtive, shamefaced dispersal. There was no official proclamation of innocence, no fanfare. for those who had confessed to witchcraft to save their lives. Their release was conditional on their continued adherence to their fabricated stories. Recanting could see them thrown back into the darkness. For those who had maintained their innocence, freedom came with the bitter taste of a justice that had not been granted, but merely conceded. They emerged from the foul, lightless cells-like creatures from a cave, squinting and stumbling into a world that had irrevocably changed. Their bodies were gaunt from months of starvation, rations, and disease. Their minds were scarred by the trauma of isolation and the constant proximity of death. Their reputations were in tatters. They returned to farms that had been neglected, to businesses that had failed in their absence, to children who did not recognize them, to neighbors who could not meet their eyes. The suffering of the families was a deep, private anguish that permeated every aspect of life. The families of the executed carried a burden of grief compounded by profound injustice. They could not properly mourn the bodies of their loved ones, Bridget Bishop, Rebecca Nurse, John Proctor, George Burroughs, and all the others had been dumped into rocky crevices on Proctor's ledge. Denied Christian burial, there were no graves to visit, no hallowed ground upon which to lay flowers and weep. Their grief was a ghost without an anchor, a perpetual, open wound. For these families, every sight of the gallows hill, every mention of the trials, every glance from a neighbor who had testified against them was a fresh scalding of salt. The widow of John Proctor, Elizabeth, spared from the noose by her pregnancy, now had to raise her newborn and her other children under the dark cloud of her husband's execution as a witch. The Nurse family, once among the most respected, found themselves pariahs. Their land a constant reminder of the feud that had stolen, and their matriarch, the economic toll on. The region was catastrophic. Salem village, in particular, was blighted. Fields lay fallow, their fences broken, the harvest of 1692 largely lost. The intricate web of debt and credit that underpinned the rural economy had snapped. Who would honor debt to a man whose wife was a convicted witch? Who would enter into a contract with a family tainted by association? The very land seemed cursed. Properties of the accused and executed had been seized by the sheriff, their livestock sold off, their belongings auctioned at a fraction of their value in a macabre fire sale that profited the opportune. Mystic and the grim, the community's productive energy had been entirely consumed by the trials. Now, it was left bankrupt, materially and spiritually. The social fabric, already frayed, was now in shreds. The village was a landscape of silent hatreds and unpayable moral debts. The lines of accusation had torn through congregations, families, and long-standing friendships. How could you sit next to a man in meeting, knowing he had testified under oath that he saw your mother's spectre tormenting in Putnam? How could you borrow a plough from a neighbor who had stood by and watched as your father was pressed to death? The community was paralyzed by mutual and spoken guilt and a seething silent resentment. Trust was a currency that no longer existed. The once close-knit Puritan community had atomized into isolated, suspicious households, each nursing its own private wounds and grievances. For the accusers and the judges, the dawning reality was a slow-acting poison. The afflicted girls Abigail Williams and Putnam Jr., Mercy Lewis, and the others found their power vanish overnight. Their fits, once the center of the universe, were now an embarrassing spectacle, a reminder of a collective madness everyone was desperate to forget. They faded from the public record, their later lives shrouded in obscurity and likely hardship, forever marked as the instigators of the tragedy, and Putnam Jr. would carry this burden for her entire life. The most significant steps toward atonement began, haltingly, from within the very establishment that had permitted the horror, the first and most remarkable. came from Judge Samuel Sewell on a fast day in January 1697. In a packed Boston church, Sewell stood before the congregation as the minister read aloud a statement the judge had prepared. He took full and sole responsibility for his role in the trials, asking for God's forgiveness and the forgiveness of the people. He cited his blame and shame and acknowledged the blood guiltiness upon his hands. It was an act of extraordinary moral courage, a public penitence that stands in stark contrast to the silence of others like William Stoughton, who never expressed a shred of remorse, remaining convinced of his own righteousness to his dying day. Others followed, more cautiously. 12 members of the jury signed a public statement of regret, admitting they had been ignorantly and imprudently carried away by the spectral evidence and begging G for forgiveness. Evelyn Putnam, Jr., in 1706, stood before the Salem village church and, with the guidance of the new minister, Joseph Green, confessed her part in the tragedy. She spoke of being an instrument of the devil, deluded into accusing innocent people, and asked for the pardon of the community and especially of the nurse family. It was a carefully managed confession, perhaps, but it was a necessary public reckoning for the most prolific of the accusers. These apologies, however profound, could not undo what had been done. They were acknowledgments of a wound, not a suture for it. The legal process of clearing names and restoring property was a slow, grudging, and incomplete affair, dragged out over years and decades. It was not until 1711 that the Massachusetts legislature passed a bill reversing the attainders against 22 of the victims and granting monetary compensation to their families. The sums were meager, a token gesture that could never truly compensate for a stolen life or a shattered reputation. The legacy was a long shadow. Salem Village would spend the next century trying to escape its name. It would eventually change it, breaking away to become the town of Danvers in an attempt to shed the infamous association. For the families of the victims, the stigma was hereditary. For generations, they would be known as the descendants of a witch, a dark mark that could affect marriage prospects, business dealings, and social standing. The story of the trials became a dark, shameful family secret, whispered about but not openly discussed. A foundational trauma passed down through the bloodline. The panic had ended, but for those who lived through it, and for their children and their children's children, the affair was never truly over. It lived on in the silent glances across meeting houses, in the neglected corners of overgrown fields, in the missing pages of family Bibles, and in the deep, unspoken understanding that their community had once gazed into the abyss of its own fear, and for one long, terrible year had not been able to look away. They had not been conquered by Indians or famine or plague, but by a spectre of their own making. And that was a truth far harder to live with. The events of 1692 in Salem did not conclude. They entered a long and complex process of sedimentation, layer upon layer of memory, interpretation and repurposing, until their historical reality was buried beneath a formidable mythology. The Salem Witch Trials ceased to be a specific event with specific causes and became an American parable, a dark folk tale, and a versatile cautionary symbol. Their legacy is not a single lesson but a palimpsest, constantly being written over, yet with the original text forever faintly visible beneath. This process of memorialization and reinterpretation is not a sign of a failure to understand the event, but rather the primary way in which it has retained its cultural power. The trials are a historical Rorschach test. What each generation sees in them reveals its own deepest anxieties and most pressing concerns. The facts are finite, but the meanings are infinite. In the immediate decades that followed, the trials were a source of profound local shame, a trauma to be suppressed rather than examined. Within New England's pulpits and meeting houses, They were referenced not as a historical case study, but as a theological cautionary tale. The official day of fasting and humiliation proclaimed in 1697 was an act of collective repentance for a sin against God's law, not an invitation to analyze the social dynamics of Salem village. The primary lesson was a spiritual one, a warning against giving the devil, the great deceiver, a foothold by abandoning reason, charity, and the strict rules of evidence laid down in Scripture. For a century, the events were confined to footnotes in local histories and the painful, private lore of affected families. A dark chapter whose details were too raw and too incriminating to be widely discussed. It was an episode best forgotten, its documents stored away in court archives, its physical locations left unmarked, its victims unnamed in public discourse. The 19th century, with its romantic sensibilities and its project of building a national identity, witnessed the transformation of the trials from a painful, localized memory into a national narrative. This was the work of writers, poets, and historians who looked back through a lens that valued emotion, symbolism, and moral instruction over strict historical fidelity. The Puritans were distilled from complex, devout, and fearful people into stern, repressive caricatures. Their black clothes and severe theology provided a perfect Gothic backdrop for tales of superstition and oppression. No figure was more central to this literary repackaging than Nathaniel Hawthorne. Haunted by his own connection to the past his ancestor was the unrepentant Judge John Hathorne. He grappled endlessly with themes of hidden guilt, the burden of history, and the poisonous nature of secret sin. In Young Goodman Brown, the entire community is revealed to be enthralled to the devil, a powerful allegory for the inherent sinfulness Hawthorne believed was America's inheritance. In The House of the Seven Gables, the past is quite literally a curse that poisons the present. A mansion built on land stolen from a witch victim, whose dying curse dooms the Pynchon family for gene rations. Hawthorne was not a historian. He was a moral psychologist. He took the raw material of Salem and forged from it a powerful American mythology about the inescapability of the past, cementing an image of the town as a place haunted by its own secrets, an image that would prove enduringly attractive. This literary metamorphosis coincided with the young nation's need for a founding myth, which required not only heroes but also cautionary tales. The trials were drafted into services, the antithesis of the American ideal. They became a stark, oft-cited warning of what happened when Enlightenment principles of due process, reason, and individual rights were abandoned to the tyranny of the group, superstition, and theocratic zeal. They were a potent rhetorical weapon in the fights for religious disestablishment and the separation of church and state. Figures like Rebecca Nurse and John Proctor were slowly transformed in the public imagination from unfortunate victims of a local panic into proto-martyrs for the cause of American liberty. Their deaths retroactively given a patriotic gloss they would never have recognized. The trials were no longer just a story about witches. They were a story about the birth of American justice from the failure of its opposite. The 20th century's the witch hunt metaphor detached completely from its 17th century moorings and into the global political lexicon. The most direct and powerful appropriation was during the Cold War with the rise of McCarthyism. Senator Joseph McCarthy's search for communist infiltrators within the U.S. government was immediately and effectively labeled a witch hunt by his critics. The parallels were irresistible and strategically brilliant. The sensational, unprovable accusations, the coercive pressure to name names and implicate others, the climate of intense fear and suspicion that silenced dissent, the destruction of reputations and livelihoods based on the spectral evidence of disloyalty, the fervent, almost religious belief in a vast, hidden conspiracy threatening the nation from within. Arthur Miller's 1953 play, The Crucible, was the definitive artistic expression of this linkage. Miller was explicit that he was not writing a history lesson, but a political allegory. He took immense liberties with the historical record aging up Abigail Williams and inventing a sexual affair with John Proctor to provide a clear, dramatic motive to create a timeless and devastatingly effective story about integrity, mass hysteria, and the individual conscience versus the crowd mob. The play's incredible and enduring success ensured that for millions round the world, Miller's dramatic version became the history of Salem. It solidified the trials as the ultimate symbol of political persecution and the trampling of civil liberties, a tool for critique that remains instantly recognizable and potent to this day. Applied to everything from congressional investigations to social media call-out cultures. In the latter half of the 20th century and into the 21st, the interpretive lens shifted again, focusing with new intensity on social and gender dynamics. Historians like Carol F. Carlson, in her seminal work The Devil in the Shape of a Woman, began to re-examine the trial records not for legal drama or political allegory, but for social data. The statistics were stark. Approximately 3/4 of the accused were women. A significant portion of these women were those who in some way defied the narrow constraints of Puritan femininity. They were outspoken, economically independent, or had inherited property. Childless, or otherwise unruly, the trials were thus reinterpreted through a feminist lens as a brutal enforcement of patriarchal order, a violent backlash against women who existed outside male control or who threatened to disrupt the orderly transmission of property from one man to another. This analysis reframed the events not as an inexplicable outbreak of mass hysteria, but as a systemic use of judicial terror to police gender norms and economic boundaries. Furthermore, the fact that the primary accusers were also predominantly young women added another layer of tragic complexity, suggesting a bitter internecine conflict where the only power readily available to adolescent girls in a rigidly patriarchal society was the terrible power to accuse others of the very diabolical power they themselves were denied in the mundane world. The modern memory of Salem is an industry as much as it is a history. The city itself now embraces its dark brand with a complex and often uncomfortable mixture of solemn remembrance and unabashed commercial opportunism. The Peabody Essex Museum holds the world's largest collection of primary documents and artifacts, the actual death warrant for Bridget Bishop, the personal accounts of the victims offering a sober, scholarly resource for those seeking to understand the historical truth. Just steps away, the same streets are lined with countless witch shops, psychic parlors, and Halloween-themed museums, all catering to a vibrant tourist trade. This commercial embrace often blurs the lines between memorializing the victims and perpetuating the very fascination with the occult and the spooky that condemn them. The town becomes a pilgrimage site every October, drawing hundreds of thousands of visitors who come for a mixture of ghoulish fun, genuine historical curiosity, and spiritual seeking. This tension between the solemn and the commercial is frequently criticized as tacky and disrespectful, yet it also serves an undeniable purpose. It keeps the story alive in the popular imagination. It ensures that the names of Rebecca Nurse and Giles Corey are still spoken, even if those names are sometimes heard amidst the clutter of plastic cauldrons and novelty broomsticks. The kitschy tourism, in its own strange way, acts as a guardian of the story, preventing it from fading back into the obscurity it endured for much of the 18th century. The trials remain a go-to analogy for any modern moment of collective panic and scapegoating. They are invoked during debates over the satanic ritual abuse panics of the 1980s, the fears and stigmatization that surrounded the AIDS crisis, the climate of suspicion following the 9/11 attacks, and in the rhetoric of countless political and cultural moral panics. The term witch hunt is now used so frequently and loosely by politicians and pundits of all stripes that it risks becoming diluted, a mere synonym for any unwelcome investigation or criticism. Yet its persistent, powerful resonance is a testament to the primal fear the Salem story taps into, the fear of being falsely accused, of being powerless before an irrational crowd, of having one's identity erased and replaced with a monstrous caricature by a society that has ceased to listen to reason. Meanwhile, the quiet work of scholarly understanding continues apace, largely away from the public spotlight. Historians continue to mine the court records, now more accessible than ever, not for a single smoking gun, but for a deeper, more nuanced understanding. New research delves into the local context with greater precision, the devastating impact of recent frontier warfare with Native Americans, which created a climate of existential fear and a belief that God was punishing the colony. The smallpox epidemic that had recently swept through, further heightening a sense of divine wrath, the intricate economic tensions between the agrarian, inward-looking village and the mercantile, outward-looking town, the peculiarities of local politics and the bitter, petty personal feuds that provided the specific kindling for the conflagration. This academic work does not offer a single, simple explanation, but rather a complex mosaic of factors theological, political, economic, epidemiological, and psychological that made Salem Village in the winter and spring of 1690 to a perfect petri dish for a mass psychogenic illness. The search for a monocausal explanation, be it ergot poisoning, sexual repression, or sheer economic anxiety, has largely been abandoned in favor of a more humble, interdisciplinary approach that acknowledges the tragic, perfect storm of all these elements. Ultimately, the legacy of the Salem Witch Trials is their enduring and necessary ambiguity. They are a story that refuses to be solved, a historical wound that refuses to fully heal and thus continues to instruct. They serve as a dark mirror. What one sees in them reveals one's own concerns about society, power, and human nature. Are they a warning about religious extremism? A parable about the dangers of mass hysteria and social contagion? A story about the persecution of women and the marginalized? A timeless lesson in the critical importance of due process, the rules of evidence, and the separation of church and state? They are, undeniably, all these things. The facts of 1692 are finite and knowable. 20 lives lost, countless others irrevocably shattered, a community broken. But the meaning of those facts is endlessly generated and regenerated by each new generation that encounters them. The trials are not a closed chapter in a history book. They are an unending echo, a perpetual and uncomfortable conversation between the past and the present that continues to ask us the most difficult questions about fear, justice, community, and what we are capable of doing to one another when we become convinced, with absolute and righteous certainty, that we are on the side of the angels. The Salem Witch Trials remind us that history is not just about what happened, but about how we choose to remember it. The echoes of 1690 still whisper today, the warning, a parable and a mirror. In their silence, the accused left us with questions we are still struggling to answer. If you found this story as unsettling and as strangely fascinating as I did, share your thoughts in the comments. Was Salem about faith, fear, or something deeper about human nature? And if you enjoy these long, quiet journeys into the past, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps more people find these stories, and it lets me keep telling them for you. Here at One Boring Historian, we keep history calm, thoughtful, and boringly accurate.